Neighbors described him as polite, helpful, safe enough to leave children with. In a small Midwestern town, that description meant something. It meant trust. It meant routine. It meant that nothing about this man suggested danger. His name was Ed Gein, and for years he moved through Plainfield, Wisconsin, without raising alarms. He didn't argue. He didn't drink. He didn't frighten anyone. When people disappeared, no one connected the silence to him. When questions surfaced, the town looked elsewhere. The records we have today tell a different story, but not a complete one. What follows is not a tale of a mastermind killer. It is not a story about speed, pursuit, or escape. It is a case shaped by stillness, by routines that went unquestioned, by behaviors that did not look like violence until they were examined closely. In this analysis, we will stay with what can be supported by the record, and we will sit with what the record does not explain. Because some cases are not disturbing for what they show us, but for how long they went unnoticed. Plainfield, Wisconsin in the 1940s and 1950s was not a place where people expected things to happen. It was a town built around routine, repetition, and familiarity. A place where life moved slowly enough that most days looked like the day before. The population was small. Everyone knew everyone else, or at least believed they did. Names carried histories. Families were recognized by their farms, their churches, their habits. This kind of closeness created a sense of safety, but it was a simple safety, one based more on recognition than on understanding. Violent crime was rare. When disputes happened, they were usually personal and visible. A loud argument, a drunken fight, a disagreement that resolved itself in public view. Violence that unfolded quietly, without witnesses or noise, did not fit the town's expectations. It was not part of the shared imagination. In this environment, trust was not earned through scrutiny. It was inherited through consistency. If someone showed up when expected, spoke politely, and followed the visible rules of the community, that was usually enough. The broader cultural context matters here. Post-World War II, America was marked by a deep desire for order. The war had introduced chaos on a global scale, and its end brought a collective longing for stability. Small towns like Plainfield became symbols of that stability, places where life was supposed to make sense again. There was faith in systems, even if those systems were informal. Faith in neighbors. Faith in routine. Faith that danger, when it appeared, would look like danger. Mental health, by contrast, was rarely discussed. Psychological distress did not have a public language. It was often interpreted as eccentricity, grief, or simply keeping to oneself. As long as a person functioned within visible norms, worked occasionally, paid debts, attended church when expected, deeper questions were not asked. This silence around mental health was not malicious. It was cultural. People did not yet have frameworks for recognizing long-term psychological deterioration, especially when it did not express itself through aggression or instability. Withdrawal could look like modesty. Emotional flatness could look like calm. The local law enforcement structure reflected these same assumptions. Plainfield relied on a small-town police force. Officers were generalists, not specialists. They handled traffic disputes, thefts, and occasional disturbances. There was no concept of behavioral profiling, no psychological consultation, no forensic science as we understand it today. Evidence collection was basic. Interviews were informal. Much of policing depended on community cooperation and visible behavior. If someone did not flee, did not panic, and did not attract complaints, there was little reason to focus attention on them. Crucially, there were no systems designed to interpret absence. If something did not happen, if there was no struggle, no witnesses, no immediate signs of violence, it often passed unnoticed. The investigative mindset of the time prioritized events, not patterns. In a place like Plainfield, abnormality was expected to announce itself, to be loud, to be disruptive, to break the surface of daily life. But some forms of abnormality do not behave that way. They adapt, They blend. They borrow the appearance of normalcy and remain hidden within it. This is not a failure of individuals. It is a structural limitation of a setting built for predictability. A town organized around routine is well equipped to notice disruptions, but poorly equipped to recognize slow, internal collapse. And that is the central tension of this case. Plainfield was not blind. It was looking for the wrong signals. A setting designed for normalcy is often the least prepared for abnormality. Before his name became associated with one of the most disturbing criminal cases in American history, Ed Gein existed almost entirely outside attention. There were no early warning signs in the form people expect them. No arrests, no documented violence, no reputation for anger, intimidation, or instability. In Plainfield, Gein was known as quiet, polite, and unobtrusive. He spoke softly. He avoided confrontation. He did not drink heavily or frequent bars. He earned small amounts of money doing odd jobs, babysitting, or helping neighbors when asked. Nothing about his daily behavior demanded scrutiny. From an investigative standpoint, this matters. Criminal histories often begin with escalation, fights, threats, complaints. In Gein's case, there was no such trail. The record is largely empty, and that emptiness shaped how he was perceived. At the center of his life was his mother. The relationship between Ed Gein and his mother was not simply close. It appears to have been consuming. She was his primary emotional attachment, his moral reference point, and his main source of structure. She dictated not only behavior, but worldview. According to accounts, she emphasized isolation, reinforced distrust of others, and framed the outside world as morally dangerous. This kind of dynamic can limit the development of independent identity. When one relationship carries nearly all emotional weight, the loss of that relationship does not simply create grief. It removes the framework through which reality has been organized. After his mother's death, Gein did not rebuild his life. He did not relocate. He did not form new attachments. Instead, his world contracted. He continued living in the same house, but much of it was closed off. He occupied only certain rooms. Others remained untouched, preserved. Daily routines became narrower. Social interactions became more infrequent. The absence of his mother did not create visible crisis. It created silence. This is where psychological interpretation becomes careful and limited. There is no evidence of rage following her death, no documented outbursts, no sudden behavioral chaos. What emerges instead is withdrawal, a turning inward, a narrowing of focus, a reduction of external engagement. From a psychological perspective, this pattern may suggest dissociation rather than aggression, a retreat from reality rather than an attack on it. When distress does not find expression through emotion or communication, it may instead manifest through ritual, fixation, or symbolic behavior. Importantly, none of this would have appeared threatening from the outside. In a community accustomed to privacy and emotional reserve, isolation did not signal danger. It blended seamlessly with expectations of modesty and self-containment. This is why the label monster, while culturally familiar, is analytically unhelpful at this stage. Monsters imply visibility. They disrupt. They frighten. Gein did none of these things, at least not initially. What appears instead is a man whose internal world grew increasingly detached from shared reality without producing outward conflict. His behavior did not escalate in public. It condensed in private. The system around him was not designed to detect that kind of change. There were no mechanisms to assess psychological withdrawal in the absence of complaints or visible dysfunction. As long as Gein remained calm, cooperative, and predictable on the surface, there was no institutional reason to intervene. This is not to suggest inevitability. Psychological withdrawal does not lead naturally or predictably to violence. Most people who grieve deeply or isolate themselves never harm anyone. The point here is narrower. Extreme outcomes do not always follow visible instability. In some cases, they develop quietly, in lives that appear unremarkable, within structures that assume danger will announce itself. Gein's story at this point is not one of warning signs ignored. It is one of warning signs that never took a form the system knew how to read. Extreme behavior does not always emerge from visible instability. Sometimes it grows quietly, unnoticed. When examining cases that later become surrounded by speculation, it is essential to begin with what can be confirmed, not what has been inferred, not what has been dramatized, only what the record supports. In the case of Mary Hogan and Bernice Worden, the factual frame is narrow but unusually consistent. Mary Hogan disappeared in December of 1954. She was last seen alive at her tavern in Pine Grove, Wisconsin. Witnesses recalled nothing unusual about that evening. There was no reported disturbance, no raised voices, no sign of a struggle inside the establishment. When she failed to return, concern grew slowly. This was not an era of immediate alerts or rapid response. Adults were expected to move freely. Absence did not automatically signal danger. Years later, partial remains would be recovered, confirming that Hogan had been killed. The cause of death, based on available evidence, was a gunshot wound. There was no indication of prolonged assault, no evidence of restraint. The act itself appears to have been quick. Bernice Worden's disappearance in November of 1957 unfolded in a similarly understated way. She was last seen at the hardware store she ran in Plainfield. The store was open, the register was intact. There were no signs of robbery or violence at the scene. Her son, a local sheriff's deputy, noted that the absence felt wrong precisely because nothing appeared disturbed. The quietness of the scene drew attention to itself. Worden's body was later discovered, and again, the cause of death was determined to be a gunshot wound. As with Hogan, there was no evidence of extended physical struggle, no indicators of torture or drawn-out violence. From a behavioral standpoint, these similarities matter. In both cases, the victims were approached in familiar environments, places where they felt safe, places where strangers would not automatically raise suspicion. There is no indication of pursuit, no suggestion that the victims attempted to flee. This implies that the interaction did not initially register as threatening. The use of a firearm further suggests efficiency rather than escalation. Firearms allow distance. They end encounters quickly. In contrast to knives or blunt force, they do not require prolonged proximity. This choice may indicate a desire to minimize interaction rather than dominate it. What is absent is just as important as what is present. There is no evidence of sadistic behavior during the act itself, no signs of repeated injury, no defensive wounds that would suggest a struggle extending over time. The violence, based on available data, appears contained and brief. This challenges common assumptions about violent offenders. Many people expect extreme crimes to involve chaos, rage, or visible loss of control. In this case, the confirmed acts of violence do not reflect that pattern. The records do not show a killer driven by overt emotional explosion at the moment of the crime. Instead, they point to acts that were deliberate, controlled, and limited in duration. It is critical to note what the records do not tell us. We do not know what was said in those final moments. We do not know how the victims perceived the interaction until it ended. The record is silent on emotional context. What we can say, with caution, is that the acts themselves were not prolonged. They were not theatrical. They were not designed to be witnessed. And this is where the case begins to shift. Because while the violence was brief, it was not the defining feature of what followed. The homicides, as devastating as they were, do not fully explain why this case continues to be studied decades later. The acts that occurred after death, actions separate from the moment of killing, are what fundamentally altered how the case would be understood, remembered, and categorized. But those actions come later in the timeline. At this stage, the facts remain stark in their restraint. Two women disappeared from ordinary places, were killed quickly by gunshot, and left behind scenes that offered almost no immediate answers. The violence itself was brief. What followed is what defines the case. Between the confirmed facts lies a stretch of time the records cannot illuminate. These are the silent hours, periods with no witnesses, no physical markers, and no contemporaneous documentation. In many criminal cases, this is where speculation takes over. Here, it is where restraint becomes most important. What occurred between the last confirmed sightings of Mary Hogan and Bernice Worden and the discovery of their deaths is known primarily through later statements and partial reconstructions. These accounts, often provided after the fact, are limited by memory, by context, and by the absence of corroborating evidence. The record does not show witnesses who observed the victims leaving with someone under duress. There are no reports of raised voices, hurried departures, or visible fear. There is no documentation of frantic movement through town, no sudden changes in routine that might indicate panic or pursuit. What we have instead is stillness. In cases of impulsive or emotionally driven violence, the period immediately following the act often leaves traces: erratic travel, attempts to flee the area, sudden behavioral shifts, or visible distress. Offenders may seek distance from the crime scene or display signs of agitation. These patterns are well documented in criminological research. None of those indicators appear clearly here. There is no evidence that the offender attempted to leave Plainfield. No reports of sudden absence. No purchase of supplies associated with escape. No known effort to establish an alibi through conspicuous activity. Daily routines, as observed by others, appear to have continued largely unchanged. This does not suggest confidence or cleverness. It suggests something quieter. The absence of flight behavior may indicate that the offender did not perceive an immediate threat of discovery. That perception, in turn, may reflect how seamlessly the actions fit within the surrounding environment. When violence does not disrupt the visible order of a place, it may not trigger urgency, either in the offender or in the system meant to respond. The silence in the record also extends to emotional behavior. There are no verified reports of post-offense breakdown, confession attempts, or dramatic shifts in demeanor. The available accounts describe consistency, predictability, a continuation of known patterns. It is important to be precise here. Silence in the record does not confirm emotional detachment. It confirms only that emotional expression, if it occurred, left no documented trace. We do not know what thoughts followed the act. We do not know whether there was internal distress or rationalization. The record is silent on internal states. What can be analyzed is behavior. Compared to typical patterns of violent crime, the lack of chaos stands out. Many offenders leave a trail precisely because they react to what they have done. They attempt to undo it, escape it, or externalize it. The behavior here does not clearly align with that trajectory. This may suggest compartmentalization, the ability to isolate actions from daily functioning. It may indicate that the violence was not experienced as a rupture, but as something contained within a private mental space. Alternatively, it may reflect the limitations of observation in a small town. When people expect normalcy, they may overlook subtle changes. When systems are not designed to detect psychological disturbance, absence of evidence can masquerade as evidence of absence. The key point is this: the unconfirmed periods do not show escalation. They do not show unraveling. They do not show urgency. They show continuity. That continuity complicates easy narratives. It resists the idea that extreme acts must be accompanied by extreme behavior. It suggests that some forms of violence do not announce themselves through disorder, but through how little they disturb the surface of life. In the silent hours of this case, what is missing is not just information, it is disruption. And that absence, taken seriously, may be one of the most informative elements we have. Absence of chaos can be as informative as presence of violence. Before they became names in an investigation, Mary Hogan and Bernice Worden were fixtures of ordinary life. They were not marginal figures. They were not isolated. They were visible, familiar, and embedded in the daily rhythms of their town. Mary Hogan ran a local tavern in a small Midwestern community. That role carried social weight. Taverns were not just businesses. They were gathering points, places where conversations happened, where routines were reinforced, where people were recognized. Hogan was known to many not as a victim, but as a constant presence, someone who opened the door, poured drinks, listened, and closed up at night. Bernice Worden occupied a similar position of quiet centrality. As the owner of the hardware store in Plainfield, she served a practical role in everyday life. People came to her for tools, supplies, small advice. Her store was predictable, orderly, a place associated with problem-solving, not danger. Their lives, as far as the record shows, followed familiar patterns: work, home, community. There is no indication that either woman lived with unusual fear or conflict. Nothing in their routines suggested they anticipated violence. That normalcy is essential to understand because it shaped how their absence was initially perceived. When Mary Hogan did not return, concern did not immediately turn to alarm. Adults disappeared temporarily for many reasons: travel, illness, personal matters. The same was true when Bernice Worden failed to come home. At first, there was confusion rather than panic. Family reactions, as described later, reflect this uncertainty. Shock did not arrive as terror, it arrived as disbelief. Something felt wrong, but not yet catastrophic. This delay is not indifference, it is a psychological response to events that do not fit existing mental frameworks. For the community, the realization that something irreversible had occurred came slowly. There was no single moment of rupture. Instead, there was a gradual accumulation of questions that could not be answered. Once the deaths were confirmed, the emotional impact deepened. The violence did not feel random, but it also did not feel comprehensible. These were not people on the margins. They were not engaged in risky behavior. They were not involved in disputes that might explain retaliation. That gap between expectation and reality is where community trauma often takes root. Fear did not arrive immediately. What arrived first was disorientation, a sense that the rules governing safety had quietly changed without notice. If these women could be harmed in places that had always felt secure, then the assumptions underlying daily life were no longer reliable. This kind of trauma differs from fear generated by visible threats. There was no armed suspect at large in the public imagination, no warnings, no clear pattern. The absence of explanation made the violence feel both distant and uncomfortably close. People continued their routines, but with altered perception. Familiar places felt subtly different. Trust, once automatic, became conditional. Conversations shifted from what had happened to how it could have happened at all. Psychologically, this represents a fracture in collective safety. Communities rely on shared expectations to function smoothly. When those expectations collapse, even briefly, individuals may feel exposed without knowing why. Importantly, this reaction was not driven by hysteria. It was driven by confusion, by the realization that danger had existed without announcing itself. The victims, in this sense, were not only individuals lost, but anchors removed. Their absence created empty spaces in daily life that could not be filled with explanation. The records do not describe widespread panic. They describe something quieter and more enduring, a community trying to reconcile what it believed about itself with what had occurred within it. That reconciliation never fully happened, and that unresolved tension between familiarity and violation would linger for after the investigation moved forward. Community trauma often begins not with fear, but with disbelief. What distinguishes this case from many others is not only the act of killing, but what followed it. The post-offense behavior attributed to Ed Gein sits outside common categories of criminal motivation, and it requires careful, restrained interpretation. According to documented findings, Gein engaged in repeated acts of grave robbing. These were not impulsive or random intrusions. The graves he targeted belonged primarily to women, often recently buried, and selected with a degree of consistency. This pattern matters. It suggests choice rather than compulsion, but not necessarily intent as it is commonly understood. The removal of human remains from burial sites already represents a transgression of social and moral boundaries. But the behavior did not end there. Items recovered from Gein's home included objects fashioned from human skin and bone, altered into household items and clothing. These were not displayed publicly. They were kept in private spaces integrated into a personal environment. From a psychological perspective, the absence of an audience is significant. Acts designed to shock or dominate often seek recognition, reaction, or fear. Here, the behavior appears contained, hidden, internal. This points toward dehumanization, but not in its most familiar form. The victims were not reduced to enemies or symbols of hatred. Instead, their bodies were stripped of social meaning and transformed into material. In this context, dehumanization is not aggressive, it is dissociative. The human form becomes an object, disconnected from identity, history, and relational value. Another lens often applied is symbolic reconstruction. There is evidence suggesting that Gein's actions were oriented toward recreating something lost, rather than asserting power over something living. This does not explain the behavior in a moral sense, but it may help contextualize it psychologically. When symbolic loss cannot be processed internally, some individuals attempt to externalize it through ritualized action. These actions may indicate identity confusion. The boundaries between self and other, between memory and physical presence, appear blurred. The use of human remains as wearable or functional objects suggests an attempt to inhabit, preserve, or approximate an identity that no longer exists. It is important to avoid definitive diagnostic labels here. While later evaluations deemed Gein legally insane, retrospective diagnosis is inherently limited. Psychological terms can describe patterns, but they do not fully account for meaning, nor do they explain causation in isolation. Crucially, there is no evidence that these acts were motivated by pleasure in the conventional sense. There are no records indicating excitement, bragging, or gratification derived from fear inflicted on others. The behavior does not resemble sadism. It lacks performance. It lacks escalation toward public expression. Instead, it suggests a collapse of symbolic boundaries, a failure to distinguish between representation and reality, between memory and body, between object and person. When these distinctions erode, behavior can appear incomprehensible from the outside while remaining internally coherent to the individual. The system that encountered these behaviors struggled to categorize them. Law enforcement was equipped to investigate crimes, not to interpret symbolic acts detached from conventional motives. The language to describe what was found existed, but the frameworks to understand it did not. This gap between action and explanation has fueled decades of speculation, but speculation is not analysis. Analysis requires restraint, an acceptance that some behaviors can be described accurately without being fully understood. What we can say is this: the post-offense actions do not read as an extension of the violence itself. They represent a different psychological domain, governed by internal logic rather than external reaction. They are unsettling not because they are sensational, but because they do not fit neatly into existing categories of intent. And that ambiguity is central to why this case resists closure. These actions suggest not pleasure, but a collapse of symbolic boundaries. As the investigation expanded, it also began to thin. What initially appeared to be a contained set of facts slowly opened into a landscape defined as much by absence as by evidence. This is the point at which the case enters a different category, housed not unresolved because of mystery alone, but because of missing data that can no longer be recovered. Over the years, several disappearances in the region were informally linked to Ed Gein. These names appear repeatedly in secondary accounts, documentaries, and popular retellings. Yet, from an evidentiary standpoint, these connections remain unproven. There were no bodies recovered, no physical evidence preserved, no contemporaneous documentation sufficient to meet legal or investigative standards. The distinction matters. Suspicion and proof are not interchangeable. In cold case analysis, unverified links are not clues, they are hypotheses, and hypotheses cannot replace records that no longer exist. Large portions of the timeline are similarly incomplete. There are days, weeks, and in some instances years, where the available documentation provides no usable detail, no logs, no verified sightings, no consistent witness statements. The absence is not dramatic, it is administrative. Files that were never created, notes that were never taken, questions that were never formally asked. This is not unusual for the era. Investigative priorities in the mid-20th century were reactive rather than anticipatory. If no crime was reported, no case file was opened. If no body was found, no investigation advanced. Silence at the time was interpreted as resolution rather than uncertainty. The records we have are also shaped by later reconstruction. Statements given years after the fact are filtered through memory, media exposure, and hindsight. They may reflect sincere belief, but belief does not equal accuracy. The farther a case moves from its origin point, the less reliable retrospective clarity becomes. For families of missing individuals, this lack of data produces a distinct psychological burden. There is no confirmed loss to grieve, but no presence to hope for either. This ambiguity, often referred to as ambiguous loss, prevents closure without sustaining possibility. It keeps questions active indefinitely. Communities experience a parallel effect. Unanswered questions linger beneath everyday life, occasionally resurfacing in conversation, rumor, or local lore. Over time, these gaps are filled, not with evidence, but with narrative. The case becomes a story rather than a record. From an analytical standpoint, this transition is critical. Once narrative replaces documentation, certainty erodes. Each retelling adds interpretation, emphasis, and omission. The original silence remains, but it is now obscured by noise. It is tempting to treat missing data as a challenge to be overcome, something future technology or renewed effort might resolve. In some cases, that is possible. In others, the absence is permanent. Evidence was never collected. Scenes were altered by time. Witnesses died. Memories faded. What remains is not ignorance, but limitation. The psychological impact of this limitation is often underestimated. Investigators are trained to work toward resolution. When resolution is structurally impossible, the case does not simply remain open. It changes form. It becomes a boundary marker, an example of what cannot be known. In this context, silence is not neutral. It shapes interpretation. It constrains conclusions. It forces restraint. To treat silence as empty is to misunderstand its role. Silence carries weight precisely because it resists explanation. It defines the edges of analysis and reminds us that not all questions are recoverable, no matter how carefully they are asked. In cold cases, this is not a failure of effort. It is a feature of reality. In cold cases, silence is not absence of meaning. It is the meaning. To understand why this case could go no further, it is necessary to step back from the individual and examine the system that surrounded it, not as an abstract failure, but as a structure shaped by its time. The investigative tools available in the 1940s and 1950s were limited by design. Modern forensic science, DNA analysis, trace fiber comparison, digital databases did not exist. Evidence was physical, fragile, and often interpreted through experience rather than standardized methodology. Once time passed, degradation followed. Once evidence was mishandled or never collected, recovery became impossible. There was no behavioral profiling as we understand it today. The idea that patterns of behavior could indicate underlying psychological structure had not yet entered mainstream policing. Investigators focused on tangible acts, theft, assault, visible violence. Crimes that did not leave obvious disturbance were difficult to frame, let alone connect. This mattered deeply in a case where much of the behavior occurred out of public view. Without a framework for recognizing psychological withdrawal, ritualized behavior, or symbolic acts, there was little reason for early intervention. The system was built to respond to disruption, not to absence. Forensic pathology itself was also constrained. Determinations of cause of death could be made, but timelines were broad. Nuance was lost. Subtle distinctions, time of death windows, environmental transfer, behavioral reconstruction, were either unavailable or unreliable. What could not be measured could not be argued. Mental health occupied an equally narrow space within the legal system. Psychological illness was recognized primarily when it was overt or disruptive. Quiet deterioration, especially in individuals who remained cooperative and non-confrontational, rarely triggered assessment. When Ed Gein was eventually evaluated, the conclusion of legal insanity did not clarify motive or meaning. It resolved custody, not understanding. The law answered the question of responsibility, but not the question of how such behavior developed unnoticed for so long. Importantly, the insanity determination also closed certain investigative paths. Once an individual is deemed not competent to stand trial, the adversarial process stops. There is no extended testimony, no cross-examination, or no systematic reconstruction of internal reasoning. What remains is a clinical conclusion, not a narrative one. This creates a paradox. The more the system recognizes its limits, the fewer answers it can produce. Historical context compounds this constraint. Rural law enforcement agencies operated with minimal resources. Officers were embedded in the communities they policed. Investigations relied heavily on familiarity and trust. While this model works well for visible crime, it is ill-suited to identifying behavior that blends into daily life. There is also the issue of categorization. When behavior does not fit known criminal types, systems struggle to classify it. Without classification, there is no procedural path forward. Files stall not because of negligence, but because there is no defined next step. Over time, these constraints accumulate. Evidence degrades, witnesses age, institutional memory fades. What was once a solvable question becomes a historical one. This does not mean the case failed. It means the system reached its boundary. Modern audiences often assume that unresolved cases imply exceptional offenders, individuals so intelligent or cunning that they evade capture. In reality, many cases remain unresolved because they emerge at the edge of what a system can process. They reveal gaps not in effort, but in capacity. The investigation into this case did not end because the truth was found. It ended because the available tools had been exhausted. Understanding this distinction is critical. It shifts the focus away from mythologizing the offender and toward examining the limits of institutional knowledge. It reframes unresolved cases not as puzzles awaiting genius, but as records shaped by time, technology, and structure. In that sense, the lack of further conclusions is not mysterious. It is consistent, and it is instructive. Many cases remain unresolved, not because offenders are brilliant, but because systems are finite. The legal conclusion of this case arrived without the structure most people associate with justice. There was no prolonged trial, No public weighing of evidence through adversarial argument, no narrative arc that moved from accusation to verdict in a courtroom. Instead, the process ended quietly. After his arrest, Ed Gein was evaluated and determined to be mentally incompetent to stand trial. Under the law, this finding carried specific consequences. It meant that he could not meaningfully participate in his own defense. He could not be subjected to standard criminal proceedings. The question of guilt, as it is typically resolved, was never formally adjudicated. This determination resolved one problem and created another. From a legal standpoint, the issue of custody was addressed. Gein was committed to a state psychiatric institution where he would remain for decades. The system ensured that he was removed from the community and placed under supervision. In that sense, public safety was achieved. But legal resolution is not the same as narrative resolution. A traditional trial produces a record, testimony is preserved, motives are argued, timelines are challenged, contradictions are exposed. Even when conclusions are disputed, the process itself generates a shared account of events. Here, that process never occurred. There was no formal reconstruction of internal reasoning, no sustained examination of intent, no opportunity for the legal system to interrogate meaning. The case moved directly from investigation to confinement, bypassing the stage where stories are typically shaped. This absence matters. For families of victims, there was no moment when questions were publicly addressed and weighed, no acknowledgement through courtroom language that might frame loss within a broader explanation. The law acted decisively, but quietly, leaving emotional and psychological needs unmet. For the community, the outcome offered safety without understanding. The individual at the center of the case was no longer present, but the events themselves remained opaque. The lack of a trial meant there was no collective processing of what had occurred. From an analytical perspective, the insanity ruling closes doors as much as it opens them. It affirms that the individual was not operating within conventional cognitive boundaries, but it does not specify how those boundaries failed or why. It labels incapacity without illuminating its development. The result is a case that is legally finished, but intellectually unfinished. The law did what it is designed to do within its scope. It identified incapacity, it assigned custody, it prevented further harm. What it could not do, and does not claim to do, is provide meaning. Meaning belongs to a different domain. It emerges through narrative, reflection, and analysis over time. It requires access to testimony, contradiction, and context. When those elements are absent, meaning remains provisional. This is not a flaw in the law. It is a reminder of its limits. Legal systems are designed to answer specific questions. Who is responsible? What action must be taken? They are not designed to explain how a life unfolded in silence or why certain behaviors escaped notice for so long. In this case, the legal endpoint marks not a conclusion, but a boundary. Beyond that boundary, understanding becomes speculative and restraint becomes necessary. Law can determine custody, but not meaning. When this case is viewed from a distance, stripped of speculation and cultural mythology, what remains is not a riddle waiting for a final answer. It is a study in limits of the human mind, of institutional systems, and of our own expectations as observers. From a psychological perspective, the case challenges the assumption that extreme outcomes require extreme warning signs. Much of the behavior described in this record did not emerge from visible volatility or public breakdown. It appears instead to have developed alongside routine, politeness, and social invisibility. This does not make it predictable, and it does not make it explainable in simple terms. It reminds us that internal collapse does not always announce itself externally. At the same time, the case cautions against overinterpretation. Psychological analysis can identify patterns, withdrawal, dissociation, symbolic behavior, but it cannot reconstruct an inner life with certainty. The absence of testimony, the the lack of sustained narrative, and the constraints of retrospective evaluation all impose boundaries. What we describe are tendencies, not truths. The system surrounding the case offers its own lessons. Law enforcement, forensic science, and mental health frameworks function within the knowledge and tools of their time. In this instance, those tools were finite. They were not designed to detect slow, quiet deterioration, nor to preserve every question for future examination. The case did not stall because effort was lacking, but because capacity was. This distinction matters. It shifts the focus away from mythologizing individuals and toward understanding structural reality. Many cases become cold, not because they hide brilliant secrets, but because the conditions necessary for resolution never existed in the first place. There is also a lesson here about uncertainty itself. Modern audiences are often conditioned to expect closure, a final revelation, a definitive explanation, a sense that every story can be neatly concluded. This case resists that impulse. It does not reward speculation. It does not support alternate endings. What it offers instead is discomfort of a quieter kind. We are left with confirmed facts that do not explain motivation, with behaviors that suggest meaning without clarifying it, and with silence where narrative would normally appear. That silence is not an invitation to fill gaps with imagination. It is a boundary that demands respect. Living with uncertainty does not mean abandoning inquiry. It means accepting that inquiry has edges. It means understanding that some questions remain unanswered, not because we failed to ask them, but because the conditions required to answer them no longer exist. In that sense, this case is not unfinished. It is complete in a different way. It shows us how ordinary settings can fail to recognize extraordinary breakdowns. How systems designed for order can overlook slow disintegration. And how analysis, when practiced responsibly, must sometimes stop short of conclusion. The value of examining this case lies not in solving it anew, but in understanding what it reveals about people, institutions, and the spaces between what is visible and what is real. Some stories end with answers, some end with explanations, and some, like this one, end by asking something quieter of us. Some cases do not ask to be solved, they ask to be understood.